Hello, and welcome to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. I'm Ryan Purvis, your host, supported by our producer Heather Bicknell. In this series, you'll hear stories and opinions from experts in the field, stories from the front lines, the problems they face and how they solve them, the areas they focused on from technology, people and processes, to the approaches they took that will help you to get to the scripts with the digital workspace inner workings. Welcome to the podcast. Do you want to give us a brief introduction to who you are?
Yes, yeah. I'm Mike. I'm passionate about the data analytics, machine learning space. Actually, more specifically, how that interplays with human behavioral economics. I write a lot about the subject. I'm a Forbes columnist and also a best-selling author. Professionally, my career began with Accenture. Moved on to De Beers, the diamond miners, where I helped establish their business intelligence function. A brief stint at Expedia, and then lastly, justgiving.com, where we used a suite of algorithms to help grow the world of giving. We were making 150 million a year in donations, and then sold the company when we were making 400 million a year. And analytics, data, and machine learning had a really big part in growing the organization. Right now, I'm the founder of a startup that's looking to disrupt that whole world of business intelligence. We've just completed our seed round and closed it literally yesterday. And
congratulations.
Thank you. And we're hoping to launch in the next few months. So yeah, exciting times.
Cool. What's the name of the startup? I don't think I got that. Or can you not say it?
Decidable.
Oh, Decidable.
Yeah, and essentially, if business intelligence and data is to help with human decision making, we want to make that world significantly more decidable than it is at the moment. So, yeah, I'm working on it.
I must admit, it's one of the areas I've had huge problems, but it's always a challenging space to take data and make it visible or viewable by someone. And you always got to try to work to that almost lowest common denominator of the person that's going to be looking at it. Some people want a rich experience, and some people just want a red dot that says this is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Some people just want the answer. So yeah, exactly.
Oh, great stuff. So we're talking about fiber and all the rest of it. I was going to tell you we just bought a house in West Sussex, and everywhere around us has got fiber except for our little area.
No.
And you can't find a reason why. It's almost like they deliberately ignored our little area. Someone didn't pay something.
Is it like you're in a little island that doesn't have it, or are you just like on the edge?
So if I walk, if I walk up and down the streets, I can see all the cables being laid everywhere else except for our road. And I mean, our road, so there's a long road that's been around. I mean, it's the original road of Horsham. And then we've got a little branch off it, which is our road. But that whole long road doesn't have fiber on it. So it's just that long road, and our road is attached to it. So I don't know why it was missed. I don't know if there was a real reason or just a planning problem or what. But there's no end in sight to when we'll actually have it in the road.
Yeah, let's hope you don't have one of those neighbors that's caused you a problem.
You probably find it is something silly like that, because that's something I have learned, and you mentioned it, is they come to your door and they go no further. It's one of those things. They come to that point and they're like, we're not going past there. So yeah. Exactly. Great. So I think, just to give everyone context, so we spoke because I saw a post that you put on LinkedIn with your son putting together an Excel spreadsheet to build his computer. And I really liked that. And I wanted to explore that. Well, that was one of the reasons I wanted to chat to you. And then obviously I read your book as well, which was another thing that's worth chatting about. Do you want to give some continuance on the story with your son and his computer?
Yes, absolutely. And he should be with us shortly, actually. He's I think he was mid-game. So apparently that's more important.
Priorities.
But yeah, I think so. Let me tell you a bit about the book before he joins, if that's okay, if we do it that round. So the book actually took me about 3 years to write, and that's because I'm not an author. English, perhaps. I'm a little dyslexic, and English isn't my speciality, if you like. I'm more on the mathematics side of things. And it began as an angry letter, and then sort of evolved into a book. And the frustration grew from organizations that were investing quite heavily in this world of data, machine learning, and AI, but failing to see any return on investment. And then on the back of that, making it a technical reason as to why they couldn't get it to work. And anybody who's been in that space, particularly now with all the advancements of the tools and the technology, we know that it's more to do with the people. And there's organizational elements that are required to get that right. So that's where the frustration came from. And it eventually grew into a formula, if you like, for what businesses and organizations should look at, a blueprint, let's call it, of things they should do to make sure they at least tick the right boxes to make sure that data and analytics actually delivers value for them. So yeah, that's the journey, if you like, on the book.
Well, yeah, it resonated so well with me because I basically highlighted most of the book.
Right.
I think there's probably less unhighlighted sections than there are highlighted sections, and it's probably because of the exact similar frustrations.
Yeah,
getting involved in a project and just seeing that it's not going to work because of the people and the process being just the technology is usually not the problem.
Yes,
because now, and especially when I'm talking about 10 years ago, what we have now compared to what we had 10 years ago, there's no excuse for the technology to not be
absolutely
suitable.
Absolutely, and we're talking about challenges like, do you even know what you want to do with that technology, right? It's all well and good having and buying it and purchasing it and getting a team in place, but to what end, right? And then to put that responsibility on a technical team whose domain expertise is to deliver technology, not to understand your business to the extent that they can identify all of those opportunities. And you need the balance, right? But whole thing of it's up to you, tech, work it out. And tech love doing tech. But we don't enjoy really understanding the business to the degree that you do as a domain owner to be able to then find holes and opportunities and realizing that there is the balance. Because I even found when it was left with the tech teams would be like, yeah, I'm happy to go in and find a use case. But they would often choose a use case that satisfies the tech needs, if you like. It's like, this is a really interesting, very technical project. That's what we're going to do. Whereas there's low hanging fruit that may be less interesting on the tech side, but delivers huge value, and so that balance is so key to get right.
No, you're spot on. It's a problem I see often. And that criteria, the sort of priority versus impact sort of Cartesian plane, if you like. The tech guys always pick the ones that they can look the best at and get the best, bells and whistles associated to it, but has no real business value at all. Absolutely. So I totally get that. And the behavioral economics piece, is that something that spun out of that?
Well, that also I can say is perhaps a historical, a generational one almost, because my granddad was a psychiatrist in, we've got a little dog that thinks its reflection is another animal. And I've got my son here now, so I'll explain very briefly about the behavioral economics piece. Hi, Caleb.
Hi.
Hey, Caleb. Nice to meet you. I'm Ryan, by the way.
That's Ryan. Yeah, you too. Nice.
Nice to meet you too.
So my granddad was actually Uganda's first psychiatrist, and and my dad being an economist with the UN. And a computer being left at home, it was a natural marriage of all of those disciplines coming together. And when obviously you jump into the world of data, machine learning, or at that time it was artificial intelligence of what Hollywood showed us, there's a human element to that, whether it's mimicking a human or interfering with the way we do life. Looking at it from both a philosophical and psychological perspective came naturally because I was surrounded by that in my family. So
okay, yeah, that's good. It's something that we use a lot when we build products, especially now. If you read books like Hooked or what's the other one, Ready Game Start or something. I can't remember the name of the title, but everything we do is gamified.
Right.
Because humans are looking for a game, it seems. Keep them interested.
Well, there's a lot in that. I think if you just begin to understand the way the brain functions, what is it we need, what is it we crave. Hooked does a really great, summary of a lot of BJ Fogg's science around, building addictive technology, or a technology that you can use to increase engagement significantly. And there are, I think a lot of good use cases, particularly from a public policy perspective, where that technology is really useful. And then now, if you watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, you can understand some of the more sense of jumping into that technology. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a great movie. I think it really expressed a lot of basic concepts really well. So,
yeah. And how, for example, we do need that ethical layer on technology. A lot of the time we talk about ethics purely in artificial intelligence, but in technology as a whole, particularly as we are able to now build very, increasingly persuasive technology, we do need an ethical governing body of some sort just to make sure we're getting all of that right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, sure. Anyway, I can see that our other guests is getting bored.
Yeah. So let me tell you about Caleb and the story behind that. So why did you want to build a PC?
Because I thought a couple months.
Talk to Ryan. Yeah, talk to Ryan.
A couple months before, Dad got me a laptop, and so I wanted a PC, and so Dad came up with this great idea to build one instead of having to buy the whole thing. And then a couple of days after that, or maybe a month after that, we started buying the pieces, and then when they all came, we started building.
So who told you about who came up with which pieces needed and so forth?
Me.
You did? How did you do that?
There was a video. And there was lots of different pieces in the description of the video. So I chose from there.
Yeah.
So maybe just give us a bit of background to yourself, Caleb. You're how old now? Was it 9? I think.
Yeah.
9. And when you started building the PC, were you still 9, or were you just turned 9? I can't remember.
8.
Oh, 8. Okay. And did you build the machine yourself, or did your dad do some of it?
My dad helped.
He held the torch for you while you screwed everything in. Good. So what did you end up buying? What was the things you were looking for?
So first off, we bought like stuff from the inside before we bought the outside part.
That's a good move, yeah.
Well, it's inside that we buy.
First we buy the graphics card, I think.
Yeah.
And then we bought the motherboard.
Yeah.
And then I remember it's the day after we bought the chassis.
Yeah.
And then we also bought the CPU cooler and the CPU. The CPU was on the same day as the chassis, I think.
Yeah. So he's very literal, like me. So we asked him what order, and he's now remembering it in sequence rather.
No, I was about to say. I mean, this is probably the one skill that every young kid should know how to do, is to build a computer from scratch in order. Because I tell you, the reason why I say choosing the chassis last is such a good thing, because I've done it the other way around once or twice, and you end up with this oh no moment when you realize that the motherboard doesn't actually fit, and it changes the whole design.
I can see that would happen, because I've never built a PC before, and if I'm honest, it wasn't until Caleb sent me his spreadsheet of all the components that are required that I thought, okay, we better get on with this. I planted the idea, not thinking it would take off, but Caleb went to town with it, did a lot of research, and then basically got us to the stage of building it. So yeah, you're right. There were some fiddly bits, weren't there, when we were trying to get it in? Yeah.
Most of the wires.
Yeah. The wiring was pretty tricky, particularly within that chassis, but we got it in the end. So
did you go without having seen it, or did you go with a gamer sort of box where it's got colored lights and all that kind of stuff, or did you go with like a corporate box?
A gaming one.
A gaming one.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
How many fans did?
There were about 4 or 5 fans.
Yeah.
Holy moly.
He got a really good rig, I think. I was suckered in by the spreadsheet. So
almost a blank check because your dad was looking at the spreadsheet, not at the dollar signs or the pound signs.
I was more impressed by the spreadsheet than anything else. So.
Yeah. And screens? What did you do about screens? Did you go with one big one, or did you go with 2? Or
so I had one. There's one big curved one. It was my brother's before, but now I've put it my PC into the extender.
Yeah. So we had a monitor previously, and that was for his older brother who used it for a driving simulator. He's into karting, so he has a simulator that he uses at home to practice the circuits, and we borrowed that indefinitely. Yes.
Well, that's what family's for, to share.
Exactly. Yeah.
and then from a keyboard and mouse point of view, did you go with any specific brand or type?
No, we had this. So again, my brother had a keyboard and mouse, and I used that for a while. But then on my birthday, we got a different one, a new one
with more lights. Yeah, with more flashy lights on.
So I think you owe us a photo of your setup rig and you playing it, so we can all experience your design.
Yeah, you're gonna go get some pictures for us, and then we'll send them to Ryan. Okay, all right.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Great. Well, I think you're officially our youngest guest, so you've got that as well to go with your Excel spreadsheet.
Okay, shall I let him go now?
Yeah, you can go. Enough torture.
Yeah.
Cheers, Caleb. All the best.
Yeah, he's so I have three boys, and it's interesting. They're all reasonably technical. I would say he's the most technical out of all of them, but he's also the most. If ever I was to predict what career he could go into, if we were back, 20 years ago, it would be that he's going into. He will be a developer. He just has that. He already has a lot of the mannerisms where he's happy to sit in front of a computer with pizza and Haribos and just, spend the whole night on the computer.
Stop talking to me. I'm busy. Yeah, that kind of.
But I say that interestingly because when we're talking about tech, there's a big part of me that wonders whether we will need that many developers and whether AI will be writing a lot of the code for us.
Yeah, and it's very much like the Uber problem, where you have a whole bunch of drivers that are driving cars that could be replaced by self-driving vehicles.
Yeah.
It's a possibility, but I wonder if it would ever happen, because you still need that creativity. So yes, you might have. I'd love it if the basic stuff was always taken care of, like building the login screens and building the whatever they are, the easy components, and let you just focus on that really piece of complicated functionality. I'd love that. Yeah, I could definitely see it. Have you seen much in your work of it coming up?
Yeah, well, I've seen. I don't know if you've seen any of the examples of GPT-3 that have been released. Some fantastic examples there of people basically saying, "Code, build me a social network," and straight away it gets all the code, all the front end, and you've got a social network,
Wow, no, I hadn't seen that. No, that's amazing.
I'll see if I can find that link and send it to someone. And it's quite easy to build because of GPT-3, because GPT-3 was trained on I don't know how many billion elements. It was essentially trained on the whole internet, right? It's got imagine all of Stack Overflow is sat inside an AI brain, so it's really advanced.
As you said, I was thinking I can imagine it logging a problem on Stack Overflow and then solving the same problem. So the only thing I'd seen with GDP3 was where they gave it a whole lot of articles to read, and then it wrote an article, and people couldn't discern if that was a human written article or an AI written article. That's the only thing I'd seen. Yeah.
No, I think those people who managed to get early access before it was, I think Microsoft have the charging license for it now, but there were quite a few applications that were built that were genuinely fascinating. I mean, really, you were limited by your bounds of creativity, as you say, in terms of what you could get it to do. Just imagine it had been trained on pretty much the whole internet, so. In terms of a language model, it was on another planet.
That's a scary and amazing thought that something exists already today that you could, in essence, tailor what you want out of it. Wow.
Yeah, it completely changes the game, Ryan, because if you remember that with machine learning, the basic concept is we get a lot of data. And there's a challenge to getting the data, because if it doesn't exist in a database, you have to start storing it in a database. Then you split that into your training set and then your test set, train the machine, and then you have all these overfitting problems because your data only covers one small part of the universe. And then eventually it does it. Whereas now with GPT-3, you can do short shot or zero shot learning, where you don't have a training set, you just put the task together. But because it's been trained on the whole internet, there's so much that it can do.
So is that, I haven't really looked into this in depth. So is GDP3 hosted somewhere and you're just using the libraries?
Yeah, I believe or something to that ilk, and that sort of setup. I think it's basically an API-based access. From what I understand, so.
That's pretty cool. That's very
it is.
Cool.
It's definitely worth looking at.
Yeah, because what you're saying now, in the sense of approaching a machine learning project, is so true, and it's that getting unstructured stuff into structured formats and the overhead, not only of just getting the data in the right format, but trying to understand the context of what you've got and what's missing more often than what you've got. Is such a challenge. That's
true. Yeah. So it's and I've just pulled out. I had the numbers on what it was trained on. So if Turing NLG, which was released in 2019 by Microsoft, was trained on 17 billion, let's call it elements of data, right?
Yeah.
GPT-3 was 175 billion.
Wow.
So
that's amazing. That's massive numbers. Huh?
Order of magnitude bigger, Wow. Yeah.
And out of interest, in your new startup, are you going to use something like GDP3, or have you got a different approach completely?
Well, we've got a slightly different approach, but it doesn't hurt if we could get access to it. Why not? Because that's a lot of work done for us already. When I think one of the big advantages with GPT-3 is because it's been trained on so many variables in so many different, perhaps contexts and languages and so forth. Like you said, it could write an article, right? That's a pre-trained language model that is more advanced than any other pre-trained language model that exists. So machines that can begin to talk to you, communicate with you, and so forth, understand sentiment, understand context, understand all of those things. I think it's a different world. It's huge, and this stuff is happening much faster than we're ready for.
Well, that is, when you mentioned the sort of the technology and how that impacts things, I think that's one of our challenges. There's too many options, but also the technology change is so quick that you just think you've got your head around something, and then there's a new piece of technology that does it slightly differently, or it makes what you knew before redundant.
Yeah.
So I mean, when you look at a project now or deal with a customer, do you have a preset of things you'd use to solve the problem, or do you take it on the problem first and then look at what tools you'd use?
So I would say it's look at the problem first, because there's so many advancements that happen so quickly. Like you said, you can jump into something and then within a year it's completely redundant, and it doesn't work. But looking at the problem set is absolutely critical, and spending more time on that, because there are so many intricate details around. Particularly if you remember back in the day when we used to capture requirements for dev projects, non-functional requirements as an example, right? So doing the task right now is not enough. You need to get a better understanding of some functions. A good example in the world of AI is explainability, right? We live in a world where you can't just do something. You have to explain a little bit more why, right? So why were you rejected for the mortgage? Why was this happening? And why is it picking these clients over those clients? And that sort of thing. And if you have a requirement for high explainability, there's certain algorithms and approaches you just can't use. And so getting the problem set really clear is absolutely key to the success of the project.
And how do you lead someone through getting clear on what that problem is? Because often people will think the problem is ABC. Meanwhile, when you actually ask, like you do the 5 whys technique, for example, you realize that the problem is actually something else completely, but it was just a symptom that you were actually thinking was the problem.
Yeah. So I think 5 whys is a tried and tested method to try and get to that. The other approach is business goals. And the last one that we tend to do is now this has all changed post-COVID, but previously we used to use Lego.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because you get a bunch of executives in the room to play with Lego. Firstly, they're disarmed by the fact that, hang on, this is supposed to be a serious session and you brought me in with a bunch of toys, right? And immediately a lot of them get upset. They're like, what on earth is this going to do? By the end of the session, they're all like, look at my amazing model, and everything. So it completely changes. But Lego, we use a process called Lego Serious Play, which I really advocate. Put together by, I believe it was Lego themselves, with a couple of professors from an MBA school somewhere, where they, the challenge they had was that they were saying they're a creative organization. How come their strategy meetings are so boring and ineffective? And this is at a time when Lego or Play was being taken over by Nintendo and games and so forth. So Lego was really struggling to capture the attention of certain children. And they came up with Lego Serious Play. But the science behind that is fascinating because they also call it thinking with your hands. And the moment you start, doing that, you stimulate a whole bunch of extra, let's call it neurons or those elements in the brain that stimulate creativity to a degree that you've never thought of before, right? And so Lego Serious Play, I think, is fantastic at that. But the one trick to get that to work even more effectively is to put people in the room to increase what we call the diversity of thought. So put people in the room that wouldn't normally be in the room to have that discussion. And on a couple of occasions, I remember back where gathering requirements and trying to find, let's say, the problem or a new way of looking at something. And it was the PA who was in there taking notes that came up with the answer. And just and there's a great book. I wish I could remember when they talk about innovation. Innovation tends to happen on the edges, not in the middle where all the concentrated knowledge is. It happens on the edge, and it's about getting people from the edge into the room to have that conversation and participate, because that's where innovation comes from.
Yeah, it's funny. This has come up twice now this week as a mechanism where you're trying to get, one, using Lego. But 2, you're trying to get people to get out of their roles in an organization and share things using sort of indirect means. I'm looking at the website now. It was developed 20 years ago by Lego, by a guy by the name of Kirk Christensen, who was the owner of Lego at the time, and Kirk Christensen. And now he's joined Trivium, which is actually if you want to get certified, which I want to now look into because it's come up twice. So it must mean something. But they got a beautiful picture here of guys building all sorts of contraptions, and you create a landscape of all these contraptions, and that becomes your world.
Yeah. And there's a structured approach to the thinking in that, and it's quite abstract, but it really jumps into your business, or into your way of thinking and really pulls out creativity. It's great for team building. It's great for strategic thinking. It's absolutely fantastic for strategic thinking. I use it on the AI side of things because you do kind of need to get out of the box. The trouble we have with AI is that a lot of people tend to think of the use cases that everybody else is doing. If my competitors churn, then I also have to build a churn model. If my competitor is doing recommendations, then I have to do recommendations, and just missing all the extra value that AI could potentially bring you.
But you don't think that those sort of models, churn and recommendation and whatever else, are commodities now? You should just go and rent them from Microsoft or AWS or Amazon or Google, use their models and
it all depends on the domain. So I'll give you an example where a canned recommendation model, of which they exist, by the way, couldn't work for us. This was at Just Giving. So most recommendation models are built on either product sales, primarily product sales, or even content delivery, which plays on the lookalike approach. Whereas at Just Giving, the domain where giving is so inherently personal, and giving changes over time. So, what we did is we studied giving for a long time, and we saw that, for example, the moment I became a parent, children-related charities were more important to me than they were before. Because of where I'm from, anything giving to Africa, I have a very different perspective to charities in Africa than perhaps somebody else might. And you then go through things like, I have a friend he's an ex-rugby player, and when he got married, he has two daughters, and now he's so focused on women's education, and this is the thing I'd ever seen him, care about before, but now that's something he's so passionate about. And so our giving changes so frequently that you can't say, because you've bought this product, this one is one we can recommend for you. Because you give it to this charity, we can recommend this one. It doesn't work that way. I'll give you an example of how personal it is that you can care about cancer, but actually you're really passionate about eradicating the disease, or you're really passionate about palliative care. And those are two different things, two completely different type of charities. And you can't just sort of replace one for the other, because I'm giving to palliative care because of how they took care of my granddad, and then that sort of thing. So it's those canned approaches. It depends on the domain, is what I mean,
you had that old example of I think it was Tesco. Or Target that was predicting people were pregnant based on what they were buying, vitamins and all that kind of stuff. And that actually, I think the old urban legend that's how the dad found out his daughter was pregnant. Yeah. But I find it interesting if you look at something like Amazon, for example, where you'd think by now they'd have that thing sussed, the recommendation engine, but the amount of times it recommends stuff that I've already bought, or things I've already read, and you're like, surely you guys know that I've read this book because I read it on Kindle and it's one of your apps, or surely I've bought this because I've bought this off your orders.
That is really interesting, and I would say I'm also surprised at them getting it wrong. You see, one of the things. So I teach a course on trying to get people to understand the world of AI, data, and machine learning, and I try and get non-technical people to try and understand that. And the reason why is because a lot of the time, again, like we saw when we were talking earlier, a tech person who builds a tech product is excited by that tech. And then they're ready to move on to the new thing, right? No one wants to stay developing HTML when now you can develop in Python and so forth, right? You want to move on. And so that desire to continue to look after that goes, and then you often get this thing of, we've got to replace the whole thing with new code, right? Which is probably more exciting. But on the business side, there's a lot of work to do around the skills of identifying really useful use cases for artificial intelligence, delivering the projects where we talked about things like explainability, those non-functional requirements where you as the domain owner really know them. And the last thing is managing them as they go through the life cycle, because things change. In fact, half the B2C type algorithms that were around before COVID are going to have to change now because buying behavior has changed. So
big time.
You'd be silly to just stick with the same algorithm that was trained on that previous data set. It's got to use a more advanced and an updated training set to begin to understand a new world or a new environment that it's operating. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I helped a friend of mine. They built it's called Singular Decisions. I think that's what it's called. And that was going back to the churn model and that they were looking at how do you look after the consumer of content. Because as you look at TV today, that's going more and more down the IPTV route. Yeah. So Netflix is not IPTV. I learned that the other day. But it's an actual like Sky Sports being transmitted over over the internet. But it's looking at needing a specific minimum speed of sort of 25 meg lines and that sort of thing. Whereas Netflix will run on a 2 meg line. But it's so that you as a consumer can have a bouquet of personalized channels, but that there's a need to almost manage all your subscriptions, and you can kind of see this with Amazon a little bit, where you can sign up for Amazon Prime, and then they can recommend to you to watch like Below Deck is my favorite TV show at the moment, but in order to watch that, I have to sign up for a subscription called, I think it's Hey You.
All right.
Which is like $5. But now I've got a subscription and a subscription. But one of them I'm going to watch only as long as I've got the season that I want to watch available to me. And then once that's done, I'll cancel it. But I've still got my main one. And it's really the Singular Decisions algorithm is all about trying to keep you on that Hey You subscription, as an example, so you don't cancel and you're on the grid. And then you're doing they've got an 8-step framework, which is quite interesting. As you move through the stages, they can not manipulate you, that's the wrong word in its negative sense, but to keep you on, to keep you consuming. But there could be a leaving moment, or there could be a joining moment, or there could be an upgrade moment or a downgrade moment. So maybe you're about to leave, and they say, okay, well, instead of paying $5 a month, you pay $3 for 6 months. Okay. You're like, well, I've saved $2, so that's a cup of coffee almost. So I'll stick around. Or they give you 3 months free, and then it goes back up to normal rate. But by then you've forgotten that you've actually stayed on.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting. I think I'll look them up. Singular Decisions, did you say is what they're called?
Yep. Singular Decisions.
What I like about that is it's decision focused, right? So it's its thing is to try and minimize the decision of unsubscribing completely. That's its sort of optimization function.
I'm happy to introduce you to Bhavesh and connect you guys up to have a chat.
Yeah, I would love to. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that would be really good. Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. So I mean, the other thing that I wanted to do, so you talked through your sort of history of working on the consulting side, and then moving into the company side, and now obviously you've got a startup. How are you seeing the market change over time, especially now with everyone working from home and data becoming more and more important to decide on renting office space versus not renting office space? Or, I mean, are you seeing a better question being asked of data? If that's maybe a better way of coloring it in?
It's a great question to ask. Am I seeing a better question asked of data? I'm seeing more questions asked of data for sure, right? If the consumer is now doing significantly more online and is likely to, according to McKinsey and those sort of reports, continue doing a lot of stuff online, that is going to create more data. But it also means that the corresponding businesses have to do more online as well, right? So if the online market begins to get a little saturated, you need to find a way to differentiate yourself online and become a bit smarter. And ultimately, every organization is still trying to get customers, maximize their time with that customer, and if it's financial payoff or not, increase retention, and reduce and increase the chances of them spreading word of mouth. Every organization wants to do that. How would you decide to do that without investing more in data and asking the right questions about your activities within each of those spheres? And I think what we're seeing, because I saw a great article by, I don't know which organization it was, that had predicted around 300,000 jobs in the data and analytics space for 2021. And they revised that number towards the end of that last year to 2 million, right?
Wow.
So when we're talking about a decrease in jobs, I found it quite interesting that article was saying there was an increase in jobs in that particular sphere, you know.
Well, I mean, that's maybe what the industrial revolutions are. They always talk about losing jobs, but actually it's a shifting of jobs to higher skilled. And yes, you feel for the people that are let's say lower skilled, for want of a better phrase, because they don't know anything else. I mean, you didn't grow up in Uganda, did you, or did you?
No. I actually, as a child of a diplomat, we were in many different countries in the continent. So. Yeah. Well,
what I was the sort of example I was going to give, I mean, I'm back in South Africa at the moment, and I'm realizing more and more that when I speak to certain people, that they've got no other job than to be a gardener or a domestic, because they've got no other vision, or they could be anything else.
Right.
And how do you tell that or help that person so that their kids have the opportunities that they didn't have, to be an accountant or a lawyer or whatever they want to be, and not be stuck in the same rut to an extent. And it's a depressing situation sometimes, because there's only so much you could do and you can't help everybody. And they're the most affected by COVID, because the first thing to do is keep people away from you. So you're going to keep people away that are traveling on taxis every day and living in squatter camps and that sort of stuff. Well, not everyone does that.
Ryan, the job market scares me even more because, if we think about the world of disruption and how everything is getting disrupted, right? You can name any industry is going to go through some form of disruption. Yeah. Education is going through what I believe to be a very silent disruption.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Where like now they're doing school from home, right? Let's not be surprised if something more comes off on the back of that, right? Where we see some change. It would be a shame for it not to, because it hasn't changed for a millennia, right? There's a lot of what we're doing that's pretty much exactly the same. Now, if the job market is shifting, the education market can't continue to do the same thing if its role is to equip our children for the future, right? It just can't do the same thing. And so you end up finding, I mean, we've seen a revolution of, what do they call the MOOCs? I can't remember.
Mostly online courses or something.
That's right. So we've seen a lot of that where people are now, the online course market has shot through the roof during this period. And you're like, well, they're selling things to people who don't have to have gone to uni and all of those sort of things. And you're like, I do see a sneaky shift taking place here that, we're not keeping an eye on it. And most of the time disruption happens because we're just not focused at it. It's some other people who are paying attention to it. But I do think the education space, ed tech is ripe for massive disruption. The government already tried to get AI to mark exams. There's a lot that's happening there,
Yeah, and it is something that if you look, what do we know? A year and a bit since the last lockdown. Oh, it's a year, sorry, almost in March, or since the first lockdown for the UK at least. Yeah. The amount of kids that had to be educated remotely and are still being educated remotely, but they're losing out on the social aspects and the social skills that they need. Yeah. But they're still doing this old-fashioned way of worksheets, and yes, some schools are using apps and some aren't, but not every school and not every sector has the tools to use. But there's got to be a way. I mean, you got to go to Google or to Microsoft and say, please sponsor 1 million laptops with Google Classroom or something installed, so we can do this a different way.
Yeah. But also when we're talking about, so in the tech world, we have the world of hyper-personalization. So why not personalized education? And it's so interesting. Caleb here, who is the academic of my 3 kids, he's the most academic, doesn't enjoy learning via lockdown, right? Whereas my eldest, Josh, who's the least academic, has thrived during lockdown. Like his grades have gone through the roof, and it's interesting because there's just something different about the environment that has meant this is his learning style environment. And there's a bit about me that's a little reluctant to let him. Why would I put him in a place where he was really struggling to somewhere where he's so thriving, like genuinely thriving? He manages his own time, everything, and he just makes sure we're keeping tabs on it, of course. But he's flying through.
But is that not the point? And you said hyper-personalization, but that's the problem with the education system. It's always developed on the lowest common denominator. So, and how do we train you to work in a factory? There's going to be a shift that's going to be from, 8 to 3 or 9 to 5 or whatever it is. So you're used to working like that.
Yeah.
How do you change that? Well, I think you've answered the question in a way. But how do you treat people? Because what I mean, these things were put in place based on some very old theory, which was right at the time. It was what Henry Ford used to build his conglomerate, what it is now. But how do you go? Let's fast forward 20 years where people haven't been educated in high school the same. Now they're doing courses they want to do. They haven't got a degree because they've done 60 courses that are 2 weeks at a time. You've got to hire them differently then.
Yeah.
You got to look at critical thinking, problem solving, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And you know what? Let's mix it up, Ryan. So it's not just the jobs that are changing, the technology that's changing in the way that people get educated, but also what's changing is we have a big social revolution taking place as well, right? Where there is an increased desire for equity and equality across the spectrum, across the globe. Which means that, like an organization that I worked with after uni, Accenture, will have to change its hiring practices if it's to meet the equality numbers or the diversity and inclusion numbers that it needs to. So previously, that organization would hire from, let's just say, 5 universities, right? Okay. And to get into those 5 universities, you probably needed to have been going to private school. And to get to private school, you probably needed a certain amount of wealth within your family, right?
Yep.
And you have that sort of cascading effect, which means that everyone who worked in Accenture at my time was the same type of person, right? So now you have a change in the way everyone's being educated. And organizations are focused on growth, so they need the skill set, right? They're not going to say no to a top-class developer because he didn't go to this particular uni. Is then going to have to change hiring practices, which means that old way of looking at value, with education may change. I don't know. I just feel like there's a real shift coming that, perhaps we need to prepare for.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there was that news agency, it could have been NBC, I could stand corrected, where they used AI to go through all their previous hires, so all their CVs and their careers and stuff, so they could hire based on what they thought were the best people that matched their culture. They end up hiring the same, white male, same high school, same varsity, whatever, and completely discounted most females and people of color because they didn't fit this biased profile. So I think bias comes into to a large extent, and I think you're right. The rules have changed. But it's rippling through faster, and maybe it's a hidden wave that's building up to a tsunami that's going to hit us all in the face at some point.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the time and the rate of change, right? So AI is an exponential technology. So that means it's not a straight line, which means its change is going to be faster as we move along, not slower. Right. So I think it will hit us in the face. I think we'll just be shocked by it. In 2014, a whole bunch of experts gathered together to ask the question, when will a machine beat a human being at the game of Go? Right. And all the experts said 10 years at the very least. And it happened in 2, It's just, that's what we're dealing with right now. Google are now doing protein folding, a problem that, we didn't expect to be sold for another 50 years,
Yeah.
So it's it's fascinating.
Do you think, I mean, that's all leading up to the singularity. Do you think that's something we'll see in our lifetimes?
You know what? I do think there was one thing that will slow it down, right? Is things like GDPR, because the capture of data is what's needed for us to get there. We need literally all the data, right? What we have as humans is at the moment we're still capturing and processing more data than a computer can. I think, I can't remember anecdotally, I have something like 17 between, it's either 7 or 17 million, can't remember, data points per second, right? And it's such a wide variety of data points that haven't all been captured yet in a database. So therefore, our decision-making capability is still far more superior than that of a machine in the wider context. I've got to try and remember that number. And it was a great book that I read that talks about how much data we're actually capturing as the human being. And I think that's the one thing that would slow it down. Sorry, have I gone off?
No, sorry, my wife's just calling me.
All right, perfect. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear your last little bit there because she was calling me and I was trying to say I'm busy.
No. So I think the thing that will slow us down is things like GDPR, the people's awareness on the privacy of the data that needs to be captured. If the data isn't captured, it'll take a while for us to get to that singularity point, if you like. And that's capturing known data sources. There's also the unknown data sources that, where you and I still have a gut feeling or a gut thing. Well, we haven't codified that yet. So, until that gets in the database, then we're still a way away from that, I believe. Yeah,
I mean, it still makes me think of Data in the Next Generation, big Star Trek fan, clearly, where he's trying to explore his emotions and taking hunches and all that kind of stuff. And he's, in the 23rd century. And he's unique. There's only one of him. Or two, if you really look at it. It's probably a good time to tie up there. What's the best way for people to get hold of you?
So I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. Twitter, I'm at Mike Bugembe. I'm Mike Bugembe on LinkedIn and also on Instagram. So any of those approaches is perfectly fine. Get in touch. I love speaking to people about the whole world of technology, so I do tend to respond. Or jump onto my website, mikebugembe.com. So there's a contact us section there as well. So.
Lovely. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. It's a fantastic discussion.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Heather Bicknell is our producer and editor. Thank you, Heather, for your hard work on this episode. Please subscribe to the series and rate us on iTunes or the Google Play Store. Follow us on Twitter at the DWW Podcast. The show notes and transcripts will be available on the website, www.digitalworkspace.works. Please also visit our website, www.digitalworkspace.works, and subscribe to our newsletter. And lastly, if you found this episode useful, please share with your friends or colleagues.